There is a category of watchmaking that exists because human beings decided to leave the ground, and the instruments they carried on their wrists while doing so had to work, or people died. That is not a marketing line. That is the literal historical pressure that forged the pilot watch into what it became. Every design choice, every oversized crown, every bold numeral, every anti-reflective coating, every massive legible dial has a specific engineering origin story rooted in the cockpit, in altitude, in speed, in the terrifying reality that a misread time could mean a miscalculated fuel burn over the North Atlantic with nothing but water beneath you. The modern collector market has since turned these instruments into fashion objects, desk ornaments, and status signals, and the industry has been happy to let that happen. But before any of that, the pilot watch was purely functional, and understanding what it was built to do is the only way to understand what it actually is. The story begins not with some obscure Genevan manufacturer, but with a Brazilian socialite and his aviation hobby. Alberto Santos Dumont was wealthy, eccentric, obsessed with flight, and genuinely accomplished in early aviation. He was also friends with Louis Cartier. In 1904, Santos Dumont reportedly complained to Cartier that pocket watches were useless in the air because you needed both hands to manage the aircraft controls. Louis Cartier solved this by designing a flat, square-cased wristwatch with a beaded bezel and legible dial that could be worn strapped to the wrist. That watch became the Cartier Santos, which you can still buy today in essentially the same square case geometry. The Santos is not just a historical footnote. It is the first purpose-built pilot's wristwatch, and it arrived before most people even agreed that heavier-than-air flight was a viable concept. The entire trajectory of the pilot watch genre flows from that single conversation in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. What Cartier started as a bespoke solution, the First World War industrialized. Military procurement changed everything about watches. Governments needed thousands of synchronized wristwatches for officers in the trenches and in the cockpit, and they needed them readable under fire, in poor light, with shaking hands. This is when the standard pilot watch vocabulary began to crystallize. Large dials, Arabic numerals, not Roman, radium loom on hands and indices, broad arrow markers for quick orientation, simple, legible, robust. The trench watch and the early military aviation watch shared the same logic because they were solving the same problem. A man under stress, in motion, needing immediate, accurate time information with a single glance. The Swiss industry responded by supplying blanks and movements to military contractors across Britain, France, and Germany. Longines, IWC, and others were filling military orders throughout the war, and that relationship between Swiss horology and military aviation would only deepen in the decades that followed. Between the wars, the pilot watch became something more ambitious. Long-distance aviation was exploding as a cultural obsession. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in 1927. Amelia Earhart, Wiley Post. These were the astronauts of their era, and their watches mattered to the public in the same way space mission gear would matter to a later generation. Longines is the key brand in this interwar period. In 1931, working directly with Charles Lindbergh, Longines produced the hour angle watch. Lindbergh had a specific problem. Calculating longitude during oceanic flight required precise celestial navigation, and the existing tools were cumbersome. The hour angle watch incorporated a rotating bezel calibrated to degrees and minutes, a specific chapter ring, and a movement set to Greenwich Mean Time, so a navigator could cross-reference the position of the sun against local time to determine longitude. This was not a decorative feature. This was a functioning navigational instrument, and Lindbergh contributed meaningfully to its design. The watch went into production and sold to actual pilots. That is the standard every subsequent instrument watch has been measured against, whether the manufacturers admit it or not. Germany, meanwhile, was building the most technically rigorous aviation timepiece specification the world had ever seen. The Beobachtungsuhr, the B-Uhr, was the result of a Luftwaffe procurement process in the late 1930s that demanded watches capable of functioning as backup navigation instruments in the cockpit. The specification was ruthless. Cases had to measure at minimum 55 millimeters in diameter. The dials had to follow one of two approved formats: Type A, with the triangle at 12 and 5-minute Arabic numerals around the periphery, or Type B, which became the more iconic layout, with a large Arabic numeral triangle at 12, surrounded by an inner chapter ring with minutes in Arabic numerals and an outer ring for hours in Roman numerals. The movements had to be anti-magnetic, accurate to specific tolerances, and shock-resistant. Movements like the Unitas, 6, 498, Cal 48, and similarly robust Ebosch were specified. The crown had to be large, a true onion crown in most cases, because pilots wore heavy gloves and needed to wind and set the watch without removing them. 5 German manufacturers ultimately delivered to this specification: a Lange and Söhne, IWC, Laco, Stoa, and Wempe. Each firm produced watches to the same spec but with individual production details, and today, those differences between makers are the obsession of a highly specialized collector community that pays 5 to 6 figures for genuine examples. The Type B layout, with its inner rotating chapter ring, operated by the large crown at 12 o'clock, is the most distinctive and copied dial design in aviation watch history. Bell and Ross built an entire brand around it. The crown at 12 position on the B-Uhr was intentional. It prevented the crown from digging into the pilot's hand during flight. The rotating inner ring allowed the pilot to set a reference time or note a start time for a maneuver and then read elapsed minutes at a glance. The case sizes were enormous by any contemporary standard. 55 millimeters of steel on the wrist sounds extreme today, but it was designed to be worn over a flight suit, over a glove, read quickly, and forgotten until needed. These were not watches you admired at dinner. They were instruments you glanced at while managing an aircraft. IWC's role in aviation watch history is particularly deep and continues unbroken from the 1930s to today. The brand began supplying watches to the British Royal Air Force in the early 1940s, and the RAF relationship produced the Mark series. The IWC Mark X appeared during the war, followed by the legendary Mark XI in 1948. The Mark XI is the watch that serious pilot watch collectors treat as the benchmark of functional mid-century design. It ran the caliber 89, a movement built to RAF specifications for anti-magnetic performance, with a soft iron inner cage protecting the movement from magnetic interference, a problem that had become acute in cockpits filled with electronic equipment. The dial is a masterwork of functional minimalism: matte black, Arabic numerals, a clear simple seconds hand, nothing decorative, nothing wasted. The Mark XI remained in official RAF service until 1981. A military-issue tool watch that stayed in service for over 30 years is the clearest possible evidence that the design was correct. IWC has been trading on this heritage ever since, and largely deserved to. Breitling entered the pilot watch narrative in 1952 with the Navitimer, and the Navitimer deserves its legendary status even if Breitling's marketing has occasionally leaned harder on the nostalgia than the reality warrants. The Navitimer incorporated a circular slide rule, Bezel, the AOPA slide rule specifically, which allowed pilots to calculate airspeed, rate of climb, fuel consumption, time distance speed problems, and unit conversions without any additional equipment. This was real functionality. The Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association officially endorsed the watch, and Breitling had it engraved on the bezel, which tells you something about how seriously the tool credentials were taken. The Navitimer's case shape, with its triple register chronograph layout and the distinctive scalloped bezel with its slide rule markings, is one of the most recognizable dial surfaces in watchmaking. Reference 806 is the original, produced from 1952. Subsequent generations changed the movements, case dimensions, and details in ways that collectors track obsessively. The Venus 178 movement in early pieces gave way to the Valjoux 72, then to various other calibers, and the differences matter to serious collectors even if the dial looks broadly similar across decades of production. The Glycine Airman appeared in 1953, and it solved a different pilot problem, crossing time zones. Long-haul aviation was demanding that pilots and navigators track multiple time zones simultaneously, and the Airman addressed this with a 24-hour dial that eliminated AM/PM ambiguity, a genuine navigation hazard when the difference between 0600 and 1800 matters for mission planning or fuel calculation. The Airman's dial design, with its outer 24-hour chapter ring, is visually distinctive and functionally specific. It is not a commonly discussed watch outside serious collector circles, which is a genuine oversight because the Airman predates the Rolex GMT Master by a year and was designed explicitly around pilot needs rather than airline passenger convenience. The 1960s and 1970s complicated the pilot watch's identity in ways that the industry never fully resolved. Digital navigation systems, radio navigation, and eventually satellite-based instruments progressively reduced the need for a pilot to perform manual calculations on a slide rule bezel or use a wristwatch for celestial navigation. The tools that had justified the complexity of instruments like the Navitimer were becoming redundant in the cockpit. The pilot watch had to either remain a genuine technical instrument for general aviation, where these skills remained relevant, or begin its gradual transition into something else, a symbol of aviation romance, a design archetype, a collector category sustained more by aesthetics and heritage than by actual cockpit application. Both paths were taken simultaneously. The market split and never rejoined. Bell and Ross arrived in 1992 and built a brand almost entirely on the BR aesthetic, refined for the modern market. The BR01 is a square-cased watch in 46 millimeters that lifts the core visual vocabulary of the Type B dial directly. The large Arabic numerals, the bold indices, the high-contrast matte dial, and presents it in a contemporary format. Bell & Ross is a French brand designed in France, with movements sourced from suppliers, and is not a manufacturer in any strict sense. The brand has been honest about this at various price points, and less honest about it at others. The collector community has a complicated relationship with Bell & Ross because the watches are visually compelling, the aviation heritage branding is impeccably executed, and the in-house credibility is limited. The BR01 is nevertheless a genuinely well-considered design that has influenced an entire generation of aviation-themed watches across multiple market segments. The IWC Big Pilot Reference 5002, introduced in 2002, represents the most direct modern homage to the original German BUR that any mainstream brand has produced. The case measured 46.2 millimeters. The movement was the caliber 5011 with its 7-day power reserve and the enormous, unambiguous crown at 12 that references the glove-compatible design of the Luftwaffe originals. IWC was explicit about the connection and produced the watch with a level of historical awareness that the aviation watch category often lacks. The dial follows the Type B logic with clean Arabic numerals, a clean matte surface, and no decorative distractions. The power reserve display functions as a practical complication in the pilot watch context because knowing your remaining running time before landing is genuinely useful. The big pilot line has evolved through subsequent references, and the current generation has compressed the case to 46.2 millimeters, then to 43 millimeters across different variants, a compromise between wearability and heritage fidelity that some collectors accept and others do not. There is a collector psychology around pilot watches that is worth dissecting because it operates on a different emotional register than the collector psychology around dress watches or sports watches. The pilot watch collector is typically drawn to the idea of functional purpose over decorative intent. They want a watch that could have been used to do something real and dangerous. They tend to prefer matte dials over glossy ones, Arabic numerals over Roman, large legible hands over thin, elegant ones, and they have a near religious reverence for anti-magnetic protection and shock-resistant specifications. This creates a collector market that is often deeply knowledgeable about the historical specifics. The difference between a Type A and Type B Uhr, the specific calibers used in different IWC Mark series references, the AOPA inscription variants on early Breitling Navi timers. The depth of knowledge in this collector community is comparable to the vintage Rolex Daytona crowd, and the prices for genuine examples reflect that depth. Genuine Luftwaffe issue B Uhr watches from the Second World War sell at auction in the range of $20,000 to over $100,000, depending on the maker, condition, provenance, and specific reference. An IWC-made B Uhr commands more than a Stoa or Laco simply because IWC's post-war reputation inflates the desirability. This is a legitimate market distortion, but not a dishonest one. The collector community is well aware that all 5 makers were producing to the same specification and that the IWC premium is at least partly brand perception rather than technical superiority. A Laco B Uhr from the same period with the same dial and the same movement specification is historically equivalent and sells for less. For a pure value per historical significance calculation, the Laco is the better buy. For the status play within collector circles, the IWC is the answer, and the market does not pretend otherwise. The microbrand explosion of the 2010s and 2020s returned aggressively to pilot watch aesthetics because the design vocabulary is immediately legible to a modern audience trained on decades of aviation watch marketing. Brands like Laco, Stoa, and others that had direct historical connection to the original B Uhr production have repositioned themselves as boutique manufacturers celebrating that heritage. This is both commercially smart and historically legitimate. When Laco produces a modern B Uhr-style watch at a sub-$2,000 price point using the same design principles, they have a direct lineage claim that Bell & Ross does not. Stoa's Flieger line operates on the same principle. These watches represent extraordinary value for collectors who prioritize historical accuracy over brand prestige, and the growing awareness of their heritage has pulled prices upward in recent years. The seduction of the pilot watch in the modern market has a specific tension at its center. The category was defined by functionality that most current owners will never use and most current wearers do not understand. The slide rule bezel on a Breitling Navi timer is inert on the wrist of someone who has never performed an airspeed calculation and never will. The oversized crown on a big pilot is sized for gloves that its owner does not wear. The anti-magnetic soft iron cage in an IWC Mark series movement is protecting the caliber from magnetic fields that are not present at a business lunch. None of this meaningfully diminishes the watches. A racing chronograph is still compelling on a wrist that has never seen a racetrack. The tool watch category operates on the power of the original context, even when the context no longer applies. And this is not hypocrisy. It is how objects with genuine history accumulate cultural weight. What separates the pilot watch from other tool watch categories is the unbroken seriousness of its engineering origins. The diver's watch had to be waterproof and legible. The chronograph had to measure elapsed time. But the pilot watch had to be simultaneously readable at altitude, in vibration, in low light, across time zones, under gloves with one hand while managing an aircraft. The cumulative specification pressure produced dial designs of extraordinary clarity, case architectures built for grip and function, and movement specifications that pushed anti-magnetic and shock resistance standards decades ahead of where the general watch market was operating. The technical demands of aviation created a laboratory for watchmaking solutions that subsequently benefited the entire industry. When Rolex developed its parachrome hairspring with enhanced anti-magnetic resistance, they were solving a problem that aviation watchmakers had been fighting since the 1930s. The pilot watch is also the category that most honestly exposes the difference between authentic tool watch philosophy and aesthetic imitation. A watch designed for aviation from the ground up looks different from a watch designed to evoke aviation. The authentic example is almost ugly in its prioritization of function. The B-Ur, with its enormous case and maximum legibility, the Mark 11 with its complete rejection of decoration, the early Navitimer with its complex dial that makes no concession to elegance. The imitation pilot watch smooths the edges, reduces the scale, adds polishing, refines the proportions for contemporary taste, and in doing so, removes exactly what made the original necessary. This is not automatically a criticism. The market for refined aviation-inspired watches is enormous and sustained because most buyers are not pilots and do not need to be. But the collector who understands this distinction reads the category differently, values the instruments differently, and is unmoved by the fashion versions regardless of the price point. The most undervalued pilot watches in the current market are almost certainly the non-Swiss pieces produced for military use by less celebrated makers. Japanese self-defense force watches, British military issue pieces from makers outside IWC, American military aviation watches supplied by Hamilton and Bulova, all of these exist in a market category where genuine military provenance and real tool watch function can be had for a fraction of what comparable Swiss pieces command. Hamilton's military watch history alone is a deep well that most collectors in Europe and Asia have barely explored. The brand supplied millions of watches to the U.S. military across multiple conflicts, and the specification requirements were equivalent to what the Swiss were producing for European air forces. These watches deserve more serious collector attention than they receive, and the pricing gap, relative to their Swiss equivalents, represents a genuine opportunity for the collector who cares about function and history more than brand cachet.